The opening moment is shaped not by action, but by expectation. A group of children stands together in a confined interior space, a room whose walls seem to carry the memory of raised voices and stern judgments. Their bodies are still, yet tension runs through them with unmistakable clarity. Years of war have trained them in a specific emotional discipline. Wait, endure, do not provoke. They have learned that adults who arrive with authority rarely come bearing kindness. Authority, in their lived experience, has meant correction, punishment, and fear delivered without explanation. This understanding is etched into their posture, their lowered gazes, and the careful way they occupy the room, as though any movement might invite consequence. The war has taught them lessons long before any formal education could. Scarcity, loss, and uncertainty have shaped their instincts more thoroughly than words ever could. Even without visible weapons or shouted orders, the presence of outsiders is enough to summon dread. These children have grown accustomed to associating unfamiliar uniforms, accents, and official bearing with danger. Their world has been one where power asserts itself loudly and without apology, where mistakes are not corrected but punished, and where mercy is an exception rather than a rule. In this room, those lessons surface all at once, compressing into a shared silence heavy with anticipation. The camera does not rush. It allows the weight of the moment to settle, emphasizing how deeply fear has embedded itself into the children's understanding of the world. Each face carries a slightly different version of the same expectation. Some appear resigned, having already accepted whatever reprimand may come. Others hold onto a fragile hope that perhaps this time will be different, though that hope is buried beneath layers of caution. No one speaks. Speech feels dangerous. Silence, in their experience, is safer than expression. The room itself becomes an extension of their emotional state. It is neither grand nor overtly oppressive, yet it feels enclosed, as though the walls are listening. Wartime interiors often carry this quality, shaped by their use as shelters, classrooms, or temporary holding spaces. They are places where people wait for news, for orders, for judgment. Here, the children are waiting not for information, but for a reaction. They have been conditioned to expect scolding, fear, or humiliation, delivered as casually as routine. This conditioning did not arise from a single moment, but from a sustained pattern of living under conflict. Adults around them have been strained, frightened, and often cruel out of necessity or exhaustion. War compresses empathy. It prioritizes survival over gentleness, obedience over understanding. The children have absorbed this reality not as a concept, but as a daily truth. Their fear is not exaggerated. It is learned, reinforced by countless small interactions that taught them to anticipate harm before it arrives. As the moment stretches, the absence of immediate punishment does not ease their tension. On the contrary, it sharpens it. Delay can be more frightening than certainty. In their experience, silence often precedes anger. The children brace themselves, shoulders slightly hunched, breaths shallow. Time feels elongated, each second amplifying their awareness of vulnerability. They are acutely aware of their lack of control, of how completely their fate in this moment rests with the adults who have entered their space. This opening chapter establishes the emotional baseline of the story, a world where fear is normalized, where children have been forced into premature emotional maturity. It does not rely on overt violence to convey the damage of war. Instead, it shows how conflict infiltrates the psyche, teaching even the youngest to expect the worst. The children's stillness is not calm, it is defensive. Their silence is not peaceful, it is protective. There is a moral tension already present, though it has not yet been revealed. The audience is invited to share the children's expectations, to feel the discomfort of waiting for something harsh and inevitable. This alignment is deliberate. By placing the viewer inside the children's perspective, the narrative ensures that any deviation from expectation will carry emotional weight. The opening does not promise relief, it promises continuity with what history has taught us to expect from war. Yet beneath the fear lies something fragile and human. Even as they brace themselves, the children remain attentive, observant. They are watching for cues, for signs that might help them predict what comes next. This attentiveness is itself a survival mechanism, honed by years of instability. It reveals not weakness, but adaptation. These children have learned to read rooms the way others read books, extracting meaning from tone, posture, and silence. The chapter ends not with action, but with suspended anticipation. Nothing has happened yet, and that is precisely the point. The emotional damage of war is often found not in what occurs, but in what people expect to occur. In this room, the expectation of fear has already done its work. It has shaped behavior, constrained emotion, and narrowed the children's understanding of what adults, and by extension the world, are capable of offering them. The silence that fills the space is not empty. It is crowded with memory, assumption, and a quiet readiness to endure whatever comes next. The moment of arrival alters the atmosphere without announcing itself. The adults who enter the room do not do so with theatrical authority or visible aggression. Their movements are controlled, measured, almost deliberately unremarkable. This restraint is the first disruption to the emotional logic the children have prepared themselves for. The uniforms and accents mark these newcomers as British, unmistakably foreign and unquestionably powerful, yet their demeanor resists the patterns the children have learned to recognize. There is no immediate barked order, no sharp gesture demanding attention. Instead, there is a pause, as though the adults themselves are taking in the room and those within it. This pause is unsettling in its own way. The children are accustomed to authority that wastes no time asserting itself. Power, as they have known it, announces its presence clearly and often harshly. The absence of that announcement creates a dissonance. The children remain still, unsure whether this calm is merely the prelude to something worse. Their eyes flicker upward briefly, then retreat again, searching for signs of what kind of authority now stands before them. What follows deepens the confusion. Faces that should be stern are instead composed, even gentle. The expressions are not exaggerated or performative, but quietly human. There are smiles, restrained and almost cautious, as though the adults are aware of how unexpected such expressions might be in this setting. These smiles do not demand anything. They do not signal mockery or superiority. They simply exist, softening the sharp edge that authority usually carries in the children's experience. For a moment, the room seems to hold its breath. The children do not immediately relax. Their instincts warn them that kindness can be deceptive. In wartime, generosity is often conditional, and warmth can mask control. Yet something about this presence resists easy categorization. The British figures do not rush to fill the silence with commands or explanations. They allow the quiet to remain, transforming it from a space of threat into one of uncertainty. This uncertainty is profound. The children have learned how to respond to fear. They know how to endure scolding, how to accept punishment, how to disappear emotionally when confronted with power. What they do not know is how to respond to restraint paired with kindness. Their internal scripts falter. The familiar pathways of reaction offer no guidance here. The result is a deeper silence, one not imposed but emerging organically as everyone in the room recalibrates. The camera's attention lingers on the contrast between expectation and reality. The British presence does not erase the power imbalance, it reframes it. Authority remains visible, unquestionable, embedded in uniform and posture. Yet it is exercised differently. There is no immediate demand for submission. Instead, there is an implicit acknowledgement of the children as individuals rather than problems to be corrected. This subtle shift carries enormous emotional weight, even if the children cannot yet articulate it. The adult's composure suggests discipline of another kind. It implies a belief that control does not require fear to function, that order can exist without humiliation. In the context of war, this is a radical idea. Conflict has taught everyone involved that efficiency often comes at the cost of compassion. These British figures, whether intentionally or not, introduce an alternative model of authority, one that unsettles precisely because it contradicts what war has normalized. The children sense this contradiction instinctively. Their fear does not vanish, but it changes shape. It becomes cautious curiosity, layered with disbelief. They study the adults more closely now, searching for inconsistencies, for the moment when the smiles will fade and the familiar harshness will emerge. Each second that passes without that shift deepens the emotional impact. The absence of cruelty becomes increasingly conspicuous. This chapter is defined by inversion. Everything the children anticipated is missing, and what replaces it feels almost inappropriate in its gentleness. The room, once braced for confrontation, becomes a site of moral tension. The children are confronted not with punishment, but with the possibility that their assumptions about power may be incomplete. This possibility is both hopeful and frightening. Hope, because it suggests a world less brutal than the one they know. Fear, because it destabilizes the survival strategies they rely on. The British smiles, small and controlled, function as quiet acts of resistance against the dehumanizing rhythms of war. They do not erase the reality of conflict outside the room, but they momentarily suspend its logic. In doing so, they expose how deeply that logic has shaped the children's inner lives. The fact that kindness feels shocking reveals the extent of what war has taken from them. The adults' behavior also reflects an awareness of responsibility. They seem conscious of the power they hold and deliberate in how they wield it. There is an unspoken recognition that these children have already endured more than they should have. This recognition manifests not in grand gestures, but in restraint, in the refusal to intimidate simply because one can. As the children absorb this unfamiliar dynamic, their bodies begin to respond before their minds do. Tension eases almost imperceptibly. A shoulder lowers. A grip loosens. These changes are subtle, tentative, easily reversible if the situation turns. They signal not trust, but a willingness to reconsider. The children are not yet convinced that this encounter is safe, but they are beginning to sense that it is different. The silence in the room transforms alongside these shifts. What was once a shield against punishment becomes a shared pause, a space where something new might take shape. No one rushes to define it. The lack of immediate resolution allows the moment to breathe, emphasizing the emotional stakes. This is not a dramatic confrontation, it is a quiet moral crossroads. By the end of this chapter, nothing outwardly dramatic has occurred. No rules have been stated, no judgments delivered. Yet the emotional landscape has shifted decisively. The children are no longer simply waiting to endure. They are witnessing an alternative expression of authority, one that complicates their understanding of power and challenges the inevitability of fear. In a war defined by noise and violence, this quiet, composed arrival becomes a powerful disruption, setting the stage for a deeper reckoning with what it means to hold power without cruelty. The silence that follows does not break in any conventional way. It thickens, settling into the room with a weight that feels different from the silence the children know. This is not the silence imposed by fear of punishment, nor the rigid quiet demanded by authority asserting control. It is a silence born of disbelief, a collective pause in which the children struggle to reconcile what they are witnessing with everything they have learned to expect. Their minds search urgently for meaning, for precedent, for some familiar pattern that might explain why nothing terrible has happened yet. For the children, silence has always carried a warning. It has usually meant that something is being judged, measured, or prepared. In classrooms and shelters alike, silence often preceded reprimand. It was a held breath before impact. Yet now, as the seconds pass, that expected impact does not arrive. The absence begins to feel louder than any shout. It exposes a gap between assumption and reality, and that gap is deeply unsettling. The children do not move much, but internally they are recalibrating. Their instincts, sharpened by years of instability, tell them to remain cautious. Kindness, they have learned, can be temporary or strategic. Adults in wartime often wear many faces, and gentleness can vanish without warning. Still, the continued calm resists interpretation as a trick. The British figures remain as they are, composed, unhurried, present without pressing forward. This consistency is unfamiliar and therefore difficult to process. The camera lingers on the smallest shifts. A child's eyes lift for a fraction longer than before, no longer darting away immediately. Another child's breathing slows, the tightness in their chest easing just enough to be noticeable. These are not signs of comfort, but of curiosity cautiously edging past fear. The silence becomes a space where observation replaces anticipation. In this quiet, the children begin to notice details they would normally miss. The way the adults stand without looming, the absence of clenched fists or sharp gestures, the lack of impatience in their posture. These details matter because the children have learned to read danger in micro-expressions. Their survival has depended on interpreting tone and movement accurately. What they read now does not align with threat. Yet disbelief persists. The children do not allow themselves to relax fully. That would feel reckless. Instead, they exist in a suspended state between readiness and wonder. The silence stretches, not because no one knows what to say, but because saying something would force the moment into a familiar shape. Words could trigger the return of hierarchy as the children know it. Silence, paradoxically, feels safer than speech. This chapter explores the psychological weight of waiting without fear's usual payoff. The children are confronting a form of uncertainty they have rarely encountered. War has made uncertainty synonymous with danger. Now uncertainty carries ambiguity instead. It is unclear whether this ambiguity is benevolent or merely delayed harm. The children's minds cycle through possibilities, attempting to protect them from disappointment. Time behaves strangely in this moment. Seconds feel elongated, each one heavy with significance. The children are acutely aware of themselves, of how they stand, where they look, how they breathe. Self-awareness has been a defense mechanism, a way to minimize risk. Yet now it has no clear purpose. There is no rule to follow, no threat to avoid. The lack of instruction becomes its own challenge. The silence also reveals something about the adults. Their willingness to let the moment linger suggests patience, even respect. They do not rush to assert dominance or extract compliance. In a wartime context, where efficiency is often prized above all else, this patience is striking. It suggests a belief that these children are not problems to be managed, but people to be acknowledged. This belief, even if unspoken, begins to register. The children may not consciously name it, but they feel its effects. Their sense of self, long diminished by constant correction and fear, flickers faintly. Being allowed to exist without immediate judgment is a rare experience. The silence grants them that permission, if only briefly. Emotionally, the room is in transition. The fear that once filled it does not disappear. It recedes slightly, making room for something more complex. Confusion mixes with relief. Skepticism coexists with a tentative sense of safety. The children are not yet ready to trust, but they are beginning to question the inevitability of harm. This questioning is subtle, fragile, and profoundly significant. The silence becomes almost sacred in its restraint. It holds the possibility of change without forcing it. In this pause, the children encounter a version of authority that does not demand erasure of self. The absence of coercion feels radical precisely because it is so understated. Nothing dramatic announces the shift, yet its impact is deep. This moment also reflects the broader moral tension of the story. War conditions people to expect the worst from those in power. It teaches that strength must be displayed through dominance. By allowing silence instead of command, the adults disrupt that narrative. The children's disbelief is evidence of how thoroughly that narrative has shaped them. As the chapter unfolds, the silence no longer feels like a void. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back the children's assumptions and the adults' choices. It forces both to sit with the implications of restraint. For the children, this is an unfamiliar and slightly frightening freedom. For the adults, it is a conscious or unconscious act of moral resistance against the dehumanizing force of war. By the end of this chapter, the silence has transformed. It is no longer simply the absence of sound. It is a shared acknowledgement that something unexpected is occurring. The children remain quiet, but their silence now carries attention rather than fear. They are listening, watching, and slowly realizing that this moment may not conform to the rules that have governed their lives thus far. In that realization, the room holds its breath, not in dread, but in the fragile presence of possibility. As the moment continues, the emotional architecture of the room begins to rearrange itself in ways that are almost imperceptible yet deeply consequential. Nothing external changes in any dramatic sense. The walls remain the same, the adults stand where they stood before, and the children are still gathered together. Yet internally, a subtle shift is underway. The silence, once dominated by disbelief, starts to take on a different character. It becomes less about waiting for something to happen and more about recognizing what is already happening. The British presence, steady and unintrusive, now exerts its influence not through command but through consistency. The smiles, restrained and unassuming, do not fade with time. They do not harden into impatience or dissolve into indifference. Their persistence begins to matter. In a world shaped by war, where behavior often changes abruptly under pressure, consistency becomes a powerful signal. It suggests intention rather than accident, choice rather than hesitation. The children sense this, though they may not fully understand it. Their bodies respond before their thoughts catch up. Tension drains in small increments. A child shifts weight from one foot to the other, no longer frozen in place. Another straightens slightly, as if testing whether visibility is still dangerous. These movements are cautious, easily reversed, but they mark a quiet departure from the rigid stillness of fear. What unfolds here is not comfort, but the early stages of dignity returning. For a long time, the children have existed in environments where dignity was a luxury, often sacrificed for survival. Being shouted at, corrected harshly, or treated as burdens had become routine. In such conditions, one learns to shrink, to take up as little space as possible. Now, without being told to do so, the children begin to occupy the room differently. Not boldly, not confidently, but with a faint sense that they are allowed to exist as they are. The British adults contribute to this shift through what they do not do. They do not pace the room aggressively. They do not single anyone out. They do not demand explanations or apologies. Their authority remains intact, but it is held in reserve rather than wielded. This restraint reframes power itself. It suggests that power does not need to announce itself to be real, and that its most meaningful expression may lie in how it chooses not to act. For the children, this is profoundly disorienting. Their understanding of authority has been shaped by its most brutal expressions. War has taught them that those in control often compensate for fear or uncertainty by imposing it on others. To encounter authority that seems unthreatened by quiet, unafraid of patience, challenges their internal logic. It forces them to consider that cruelty may not be an inevitable companion of power. This realization does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, through observation rather than reflection. The children notice that no one is being measured against impossible standards. No one is being made an example. The absence of humiliation is as striking as the presence of calm. In this environment, the children are not required to perform obedience theatrically. They are not asked to prove their worth through silence or submission. They are simply there. The room itself begins to feel different as a result. The air seems less heavy, less charged with the expectation of harm. The silence softens. It no longer presses down on the children's chests. Instead, it opens into something more spacious, a pause that allows thought rather than suppressing it. This shift alters how the children relate not only to the adults, but to one another. They become aware of each other again, no longer isolated by fear. In this chapter, the moral center of the story becomes clearer. The British smiles are not grand gestures of heroism. They are quiet refusals to perpetuate the cycle of fear that war depends upon. By choosing restraint, the adults disrupt the emotional economy of conflict, which thrives on domination and submission. Their behavior suggests that even within systems of power, there is room for ethical choice. For the children, this is an encounter with an alternative moral reality. It does not erase the trauma they carry, nor does it promise safety beyond the room. But it introduces a crack in the narrative they have been forced to accept. That narrative told them that adults with power cannot be trusted, that authority is synonymous with danger. Now, that equation no longer holds perfectly. This realization is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it offers relief from constant vigilance. Unsettling because it undermines the coping mechanisms the children rely on. If authority can be gentle, then the rules they have used to navigate the world are incomplete. They must begin to discriminate, to evaluate situations rather than react automatically. This requires emotional energy they are not accustomed to spending. The adults, knowingly or not, give the children time to adjust. They do not rush the moment toward resolution. This patience communicates respect more effectively than words ever could. It acknowledges that the children's fear is reasonable, that trust cannot be demanded or accelerated. In doing so, the adults model a form of leadership that values process over compliance. As minutes pass, the room becomes a temporary refuge from the relentless logic of war. Outside, conflict continues, and power is exercised violently and without nuance. Inside, however, a different standard is briefly upheld. The children experience what it feels like to be seen without being judged, to be controlled without being threatened. This experience imprints itself quietly, without spectacle. The silence that once signified danger now carries a different meaning. It becomes a shared understanding that no harm is imminent. The children do not smile openly, that would feel premature, perhaps even risky. But their faces soften. Their eyes are more present. They begin to listen not for the sound of anger, but for cues of intention. This chapter does not resolve the story, it deepens it. It shows that the true impact of moral action often lies not in dramatic change, but in subtle reorientation. The children leave this moment altered, even if they cannot name how. They have witnessed authority exercised without cruelty, and that knowledge cannot be entirely undone. In the quiet recalibration of the room, the film makes its most understated yet powerful claim, that even amid war, where fear seems unavoidable, individuals still possess the capacity to choose how power is expressed. For the children, this choice becomes a point of reference, a small but enduring counterexample to the world they have been taught to expect. As the moment draws outward from the confines of the room, its meaning begins to expand beyond the immediate encounter. What has taken place is small in scale, easily overlooked in the vast machinery of war, yet it carries a weight that far exceeds its size. The children, still quiet, are no longer simply reacting to the adults before them. They are processing an experience that subtly reorders their understanding of the world. The silence they hold now is deliberate, not defensive. It is the silence of thought, of something settling into place. For the first time in a long while, the children are not being asked to perform fear. No one is watching them for signs of disobedience or weakness. This absence of scrutiny creates space for reflection, even if that reflection remains unspoken and instinctive. War has rarely allowed them such space. Their lives have been defined by urgency, by the need to respond quickly, to adapt instantly, to anticipate danger before it arrives. Now, in this unexpected pause, they are allowed to simply exist. This existence is fragile, but it is real. The children feel it in the way their bodies no longer ache with tension, in the way their thoughts are not racing ahead to brace for pain. They may not yet feel safe, but they feel less hunted. This distinction matters. It introduces a gradient where before there was only absolutes. In wartime, experiences are often divided sharply into safe and unsafe, friend and enemy, mercy and cruelty. This moment resists such simplicity. The narrative widens here, inviting consideration of the broader historical context. War is typically remembered through battles, strategies, and political decisions. Yet its most enduring consequences often unfold in moments like this one, far from the front lines. The children in this room are not shaping military outcomes, but they are absorbing lessons about humanity that will travel with them long after the conflict ends. These lessons, subtle and quiet, may shape how they understand authority, justice, and compassion in the years to come. The British presence, still calm and measured, becomes symbolic of a different kind of victory. Not the triumph of force, but the restraint of it. Not the defeat of an enemy, but the refusal to become what war encourages. This distinction is crucial. War has a way of eroding moral clarity, of making cruelty feel justified or even necessary. In this room, however briefly, that erosion is resisted. The children begin to recognize this resistance intuitively. They may not frame it in moral terms, but they feel its effect. Their silence is no longer rooted in fear of being noticed. Instead, it reflects the gravity of what they are witnessing. They are encountering adults who possess power yet choose not to use it to dominate. This choice stands in quiet opposition to everything war has shown them so far. Memory plays an important role here. The children's past experiences do not vanish in the presence of kindness. On the contrary, those experiences sharpen the contrast. Every smile, every moment of restraint, is filtered through a history of harshness. The children compare unconsciously, measuring this encounter against countless others that ended differently. The comparison deepens the impact. Kindness does not feel ordinary, it feels extraordinary because of what preceded it. This awareness carries emotional complexity. Alongside relief, there is grief. Grief for the fact that such treatment feels rare, for the realization that it did not have to be this way all along. The children may not articulate this grief, but it exists beneath the surface, intertwined with their silence. War has stolen not only safety, but the expectation of fairness. To glimpse fairness now is to recognize its absence elsewhere. The adults, meanwhile, continue to hold the space without claiming credit for it. There is no visible attempt to frame their behavior as benevolent or heroic. They do not seek gratitude or acknowledgement. This lack of self-consciousness reinforces the authenticity of the moment. It suggests that kindness is not being offered as a performance, but as a default. This matters because children are acutely sensitive to intention. They can sense when behavior is conditional, when it is meant to manipulate or control. Here, the absence of demand allows trust, however tentative, to begin forming. Trust does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, through consistency and restraint. The children are not yet trusting, but they are no longer closing themselves off entirely. The silence becomes a shared language. No one speaks, yet understanding circulates through the room. The children understand that they are not in immediate danger. The adults understand that words are unnecessary, perhaps even disruptive. This mutual recognition creates a fleeting equilibrium, rare in a world governed by imbalance and force. The film's moral reversal becomes most apparent here. Traditionally, wartime narratives frame power as something to be feared, something that must be confronted or escaped. In this moment, power is present but not oppressive. It exists without demanding submission. This inversion challenges the viewer as much as it challenges the children. It asks whether authority must always rely on fear, or whether fear is simply the easiest tool. The children's silence, now imbued with meaning, becomes a form of testimony. It testifies to the impact of being treated with restraint after prolonged exposure to cruelty. It shows how deeply war distorts expectations, and how powerful even small acts of humanity can be in correcting that distortion. The room, though unchanged physically, becomes a site of moral contrast. As time continues, the children begin to carry this moment internally, even before it ends. They are already imagining, perhaps unconsciously, how they will remember it. Memory in wartime is often fragmented, shaped by shock and loss. This memory, however, is likely to endure precisely because it is different. It does not compete with explosions or chaos. It stands apart through its quietness. The broader implication of this chapter is not that kindness redeems war, but that it exposes war's failures more clearly. By showing what is possible even within conflict, the moment highlights how unnecessary much suffering is. The children's experience does not negate the violence outside the room, it reframes it. It suggests that cruelty is not inevitable, even when circumstances are dire. For the children, this realization may become a reference point in the future. It may shape how they interpret authority figures later in life, how they understand power and responsibility. They may remember that once, in the midst of war, adults chose restraint over intimidation. That memory may not erase trauma, but it may complicate it, introducing nuance where there was once only fear. As the chapter nears its end, the silence remains intact, but its emotional texture has fully transformed. It is no longer heavy or threatening. It is contemplative, almost reverent. The children are aware that this moment is temporary, that the world outside the room still operates according to harsher rules. Yet the knowledge they have gained cannot be entirely undone. This chapter stands as the moral heart of the narrative. It does not offer resolution or closure. Instead, it offers perspective. It reminds the viewer that history is not only shaped by grand decisions, but by small choices made in quiet rooms. Choices that determine whether power wounds or protects, whether silence terrifies or reassures. In this room, for a brief and fragile span of time, silence becomes evidence of something rare, humanity asserting itself where fear was expected to rule. The moment does not end with a clear signal. There is no announcement that the encounter is over, no definitive gesture that marks its conclusion. Instead, it dissolves gradually, the way meaningful experiences often do. The children sense this before it fully happens. They feel the subtle shift as attention begins to move, as the stillness that held them together starts to loosen. What remains, however, is not confusion or fear, but an awareness that something lasting has been set in motion within them. As the adults prepare to leave or redirect their focus, the children do not rush to fill the space with movement or sound. Their restraint now feels intentional rather than imposed. They are holding on to the moment, understanding instinctively that it is fragile and rare. War has taught them how quickly things can change, how easily safety can evaporate. They linger in the quiet, not out of dread, but out of respect for what has occurred. This is where the full moral reversal reveals itself. Nothing tangible has been given to the children. No promises have been made. No systems have been dismantled, no policies rewritten. And yet, something profound has shifted. The children leave the room different from how they entered it. They carry with them not relief alone, but knowledge. Knowledge that authority does not always arrive with cruelty. Knowledge that power can be exercised without humiliation. Knowledge that fear, though common, is not the only language adults can speak. This knowledge does not erase their past. The war still surrounds them, and its consequences remain etched into their lives. They will still encounter violence, scarcity, and injustice. But the certainty that these things are unavoidable has been quietly disrupted. The encounter introduces doubt into fear's dominance. It suggests that the world, even in its most brutal moments, is not entirely closed off to compassion. As the children disperse or step back into their lives, their reactions are muted. There is no celebration, no outward expression of gratitude or joy. Such expressions might feel unsafe, even inappropriate. Instead, the impact is internalized. Each child absorbs the experience differently, filtered through personal history and temperament. Some may replay the moment repeatedly, examining it for signs they missed. Others may push it aside temporarily, unsure how to integrate it into their understanding of the world. Yet even those who try to dismiss it will find that it lingers. It will resurface unexpectedly, perhaps in moments of future fear or confrontation. When faced again with authority, they may remember that once, authority arrived without punishment. This memory will not necessarily protect them, but it will complicate their responses. It may slow their instinct to shrink or disappear. It may create space for questioning rather than immediate submission. The adults, too, carry the moment forward, though the narrative remains centered on the children. Whether consciously or not, their choice to lead with restraint becomes part of their own moral history. In wartime, individuals are often swept along by structures larger than themselves. To act differently, even briefly, is to assert agency within constraint. The adults' smiles, their patience, their refusal to intimidate, stand as quiet evidence that war does not fully extinguish ethical choice. This final chapter does not seek to romanticize the encounter. It does not suggest that kindness outweighs suffering or that brief moments of humanity can undo systemic violence. Instead, it places the encounter in honest proportion. It is small, temporary, and limited. And yet, precisely because of these limitations, its significance becomes clearer. In a world where brutality is constant, even fleeting decency carries immense weight. The children's silence at the end is not empty. It is filled with reflection, with the slow work of meaning-making. They are not yet capable of articulating what has happened, but they feel its importance. Silence becomes their way of honoring the moment, of keeping it intact before the noise of the world intrudes again. As time moves forward, the room itself will lose its significance. It will return to being just another interior space shaped by war. But the emotional imprint remains. The children may forget specific details, the exact expressions, the positioning of bodies, the length of the silence. What they will remember is how it felt. How fear loosened its grip without being replaced by something worse. How power paused instead of striking. This feeling becomes part of their internal landscape. It may influence how they treat others, how they respond to vulnerability, how they imagine authority in their own futures. Some may grow into roles where they hold power themselves, and this memory may quietly inform their choices. They may recall that once, someone chose restraint, and that it mattered. The narrative closes not with certainty, but with openness. The children step back into a world still governed by conflict, still marked by injustice. There is no guarantee that what they experienced will be repeated. But the possibility has been introduced, and possibility is a powerful thing. It resists total despair. It suggests that even in the darkest chapters of history, alternative paths exist, however narrow they may be. In this way, the silence that began as fear completes its transformation. It becomes understanding. Not complete, not fully formed, but present. The room that once echoed with expectation of punishment now resonates with something quieter and more enduring. The children do not leave triumphant, but they leave changed.